Hello, welcome, good evening. Welcome to the Baker Institute. Thank you so much for coming here tonight. My name is Kirstin Matthews. I'm a fellow and researcher at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'm also the director for the Science and Technology Policy Program, and I work for the Center of Health and Biosciences. I run their biomedical research policy program as well. Welcome to today's event, the Civic Scientist Lecture, titled The Challenges Facing Women in Science and Technology. I really would like to start off by thanking our sponsors. First, Rice University's Weiss School of Natural Sciences and Brown School of Engineering, who have been a sponsor for Civic Scientists since we've started. It's been great to make sure that this is a pretty interdisciplinary and cross-campus initiative. I'd also like to thank Benjamin and Winifred Chang, who have supported the Civic Scientist program for several years. And most especially, I would really love to thank Virginia Clark, who has actually underwritten the lecture series. We really appreciate the support. The research we do at the Baker Institute is just vital to have individuals like Virginia who help us. So for those of you that are new and unfamiliar with our lecture series at the Baker Institute, the Civic Scientist Lecture Series, it was based on an idea and vision from our Baker Institute Senior Fellow, Dr. Neil Lane, who will serve as our moderator for the Q&A portion of tonight's lecture. For those of you who don't know Dr. Lane, which you should know him, he's fantastic. But if you haven't met him yet, he is actually the former director from the National Science Foundation, and he also worked in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the President's Science Advisor under Bill Clinton a few years ago. As OSTP director, he recommended to President Clinton the first woman as the deputy director of NSF, which was Dr. Ann Peterson, which fortunately President Clinton accepted, as well as the first director for NSF, Dr. Rita Caldwell, who also was our director for NSF. They both served in those offices. He also helped create, as I was told by the NSF staff, the first daycare center program at NSF, which every time I went there, they always mentioned to me about how much it made a huge difference. In addition, while at NSF, Dr. Lane envisioned this concept of the civic scientist as really someone that uses their knowledge, accomplishments, and skills to help bridge the gap between science and society. The goal was to encourage scientists to engage with the public through maybe school outreach, perhaps it was public engagement or public policy work, like he did. Based on this vision, since 2006, we've hosted more than 30 civic scientists who've shared their passion for science and challenges they face, as well as the role in helping engage the public. Tonight's lineup is another great example of civic scientists with our three distinguished speakers, Dr. Huda Zoghbi, Dr. Cullen Geiselman Muse, and Ms. Aleida Rios. Before we start, though, I'd really like to thank our Baker Institute staff. We can't do anything without them, especially Caitlin May, Jordan Traylor, and Leah Gross for their support in organizing today's event. With all those thank yous out of the way, I really want to move on to our program, which I'm sure is why you're here. So this evening is a little different. For each speaker, we'll have somebody with a personal connection to the speaker who will introduce them first. For Dr. Zoghbi, it was scheduled to be Mr. Anthony DeLuca, but unfortunately he fell ill, so Ms. Leah Gross from the Baker Institute is going to serve that role. Michael Zilka is going to introduce Dr. Muse, our second civic scientist, and Dr. Virginia Clark, our series sponsor, will introduce our third speaker, Ms. Rios. After each speaker provides comments, then we'll bring everybody up for a moderated Q&A with Dr. Lane. We do have QR codes provided, so during the session, if you come up with questions, it will take you to a QR form. You can just fill it out, and the questions will be added into the queue for Dr. Lane to present. In addition, we have microphones. If you're in the room, you could actually submit them or raise your hand and we can ask them directly. But we wanted to engage the people who weren't here in person, so I know there's some people watching online, so they can also submit their questions through the QR code. So now please join me in welcoming Ms. Leah Gross to the podium to introduce our first speaker.
Good evening, everybody. Dr. Huda Zoghbi is a Lebanese-born American geneticist and a professor at the Departments of Molecular and Human Genetics, Neuroscience, and Neurology at Baylor College of Medicine. She is the director of the Jan and Dan Duncan Neurological Research Institute and serves as research-in-chief at Texas Children's Hospital. As a pediatrician, seeing children with incurable inherited neurological diseases and not being able to provide them with hope piqued her interest in research. Her work explains genetic mechanisms responsible for a number of devastating neurological disorders, including Rett syndrome. Zoghbi's discoveries have provided new ways of thinking about other neurological disorders, such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's diseases, autism, and intellectual disability, which could lead to new therapeutics and better, more efficient treatments. Anthony DeLuca, as Dr. Matthews said, whose daughter was Dr. Zoghbi's patient, was supposed to introduce her tonight, but illness kept him away. He says, "My family and I see Huda as a ray of light, a voice of hope, and a tireless force, driving research to identify the root causes of various neurological disorders, and then to develop new therapeutics and treatments. I just love her." Please welcome Dr. Huda Zoghbi.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Virginia, for sponsoring this lovely event. It's really humbling to be here with the company of so many wonderful women and men who have inspired many of us. So in the next few minutes, I thought maybe I'll share with you my journey in science and why I love getting up every morning to go to work. What's the secret in my life that make me feel so happy getting up and getting to work every morning? So you've heard, I started my career as a pediatrician. I came to Baylor College of Medicine to train in pediatrics, and I loved pediatrics, but I became fascinated by the brain and decided to become a neurologist, a pediatric neurologist. And it was in my first year as an intern in neurology that I started seeing children with devastating neurologic diseases. And I couldn't bear the pain of telling a parent, your child has a terrible neurologic disease. Unfortunately, we don't know what causes it, but there's a chance, 1 in 2 or 1 in 4, this might happen again to you. And that was the biggest pain, especially when you get pregnant with your first child, telling families that. So I would go home every night and literally would cry about it. It was so hard seeing all these neurological diseases and not knowing their causes. And I thought long and hard about it. My husband said, you better do something about it. You're not going to come home and cry about this every night. So think what you want to do. And I decided I'll finish my training. I'll become a clinical pediatric neurologist. But as soon as I'm done, I have to go find a way to learn in a lab what to do so that maybe I'll find the causes for these diseases. And that's what happened. The day I finished my clinical training, luckily I found a wonderful mentor, Dr. Arthur Baudet, who accepted me in his lab to learn how to do genetic research and cloning. DNA cloning and disease gene mapping was just coming on board. This was 1985, so he was willing to take me into his lab. I knew nothing about science, nothing. But he was willing, and I was going to give it a try. I knew it will be hard because it's really a different language from being a clinician, and I was at the top of my game. I was a good doctor. My patients loved me. I was experienced, ready to really be a faculty member, and now have to be demoted to really lower than the graduate students, because unlike the graduate students, my college education was 10 years before, medical school, pediatrics, neurology. That took 10 years, whereas they just came out of college. They know the latest in science. So I knew really much less than anyone in that lab. But I'm so glad I did that. I believed somehow, and I would mention something here, naivety is the greatest gift. I think youth and naivety go together. When you're young, you want to make a difference, and you're naive, so you do it. And one particular disease, Rett syndrome, is what I wanted to work on. I was very intrigued by the disorder because the girls started healthy, and they did everything a normal 1 to 2 year old will do, and then they lost all that. And they had every part of their brain affected, basically. They had motor problems, seizures, autism, intellectual disability. It was devastating. So imagine that. And it was one in a family, so you couldn't even map that gene because it's just sporadic. But that's why I went into the lab to clone the Rett syndrome gene. And of course, Art told me that's not possible. And he was a great mentor. He advised me to pick another problem that you could map. So I picked an adult neurodegenerative disease, and I worked on that while in his lab. And here I have to mention that really I owe my success in science to Art. He was an incredible mentor. I think whenever I walked into his office, he never saw a woman or a man walked into his office. He saw me and was interested in what I'm doing and how could he help me. And I always bring him up because I think it's really important that men can be the most amazing mentors to women, and I was fortunate to benefit from that experience. So in 3 years, Art thought I was ready to leave the nest and start my own lab. I was nervous, but he really pushed me. He said, "You move across the hall, I'll be here. You can do it." That's another thing that really helped me, to have a man believe in me and tell me I can do it when I honestly did not believe in myself. If you would ask me, I always doubted myself. Even when I made the discoveries, found a gene that I worked on Art's lab in my own lab, and then 16 years later found the Rett syndrome gene. It took forever because it was impossible, but it opened up the field of autism. It taught us that so many diseases can be sporadic. Fast forward to today, all these diseases I saw that broke my heart, we found the causes for the majority of them. Fast forward to today, some of the diseases that's so dear to my heart, we're now working with pharmaceutical companies to do clinical trials in 2024 and 2025. So for me, I believe in science. Science is really what changed the world for the people I love, for the patients that I saw, hundreds of them with Rett syndrome, for the patients that I saw with neurodegenerative diseases. And I would mention those were very rare diseases I worked on. Rett was 1 in 10,000. The balance disorders was 1 in 100,000. But it turns out what Rett taught us about science became informed the broader field of autism. The whole field of autism and how we approach finding the causes of autism genetically was lessons learned from what we did with Rett syndrome. Similarly, this rare neurodegenerative disease taught me so much, to the point I found the best pathway and opportunities to now tackle Alzheimer. And we're working to find a way to prevent Alzheimer. We identified potential therapeutic targets to help us find a way to prevent Alzheimer in people who had a family history of Alzheimer, who might be at risk for that, or people who have a gene that makes them vulnerable to that. So it's been a wonderful journey. But I'll tell you the best part of it. You know, the first few years, you're passionate and you're working on what you want to do, and you do it. But quickly, that morphs into training people. Training scientists in my own lab has been the most rewarding experience. And I've always wondered, how could I pay Art back for being the awesome mentor he's been for me? For me, it was really through the trainees. I pay him back by training the best possible people. I try to multiply Art's effect, and the 105 who graduated and the few more to graduate in the coming years, I hope will multiply the effects we could do to help all these people with different diseases. So it's really the people in my lab and the questions we're trying to answer and the problem we're trying to solve is what makes me excited to get up and go to work every day. Now you asked about challenges. I'm sure everybody wants to know the challenges. Yes, there were some. Perhaps the most, for me at least, the most difficult one, believe it or not, I'm that old, that's why it is this way. There was no woman scientist, physician scientist, who had children and a family who could be my role model. I didn't know who to look at to advise me. That was the hardest for me. As much as Art was a wonderful member, I remember we were at Cold Spring Harbor meeting when actually the announcement of sequencing the genome was made, and I was so missing my 4-month-old baby and about to really just fall apart and cry. I ran to Art. I figured I'll get comfort from him. And I looked at Art. I said, "Do you miss your children when you go to meetings?" And he goes, "No, it's just a few days." It's just a few days, and they're with their mother. I don't worry about it. That's when I knew I had to figure it out. And it was hard. I wouldn't deny that. I feel comfortable with you to tell you, I did live with guilt for 10 years. Watching other women womaning the mother's desk at school, decorating classroom, always being there in the face of their children, and me having to drop my kids and go to work and come back in the evening, be with them, was really, really hard. I was scared to death my kids will be a mess, or they will not be happy, or they'll feel different. But I did the best I could do. We had a rule that when I go home at 5:30 or 6, I'm with them 100% of the time. I will go to the lab at 9 p.m. after they go to bed. I was a postdoc, so you have to do that to get somewhere. But I did really worry for the longest time. But it turns out, if you love them and if you're there for what's important, I was there for the games, not the practices. I was there for every piano recital, not the practices. So if you really and have dinner with them and so on, they will actually turn out okay. And what happened when they were about 10 to 12, when most adolescents are pushing their parents away, mine were very happy to see their parents. They were not sick of us. So, and fast forward to today, our son became a physician and a psychiatrist, went to Columbia University and chose to come back to Baylor College of Medicine. And he's trying to solve the genetics of psychiatric disorders. And our daughter went to Middlebury College and then did public health, and she's now vice president at Texas Children's Hospital. So they both did not shy away from working. They both, of course, are married to working, spouses. So I think that was, I would say, the hardest thing. The other hard thing is juggling. I think, as I mentioned to you, I didn't have role models. That means as I became physician scientist and made the first little discovery, you're grabbed to serve here and to serve there. And I think that quickly became very demanding, and juggling all this and learning when to say no and how to guard life and the lab and the family was a little bit of a challenge for me. But along the way, I've met wonderful people, I've met wonderful scientists. I found that one of the most beautiful things we do in science is being generous. We're generous sharing information, and we're generous training people, sharing, giving them things to take with them to succeed. And that's a gift. All of you know, when you give someone a gift, is far more rewarding than when you get a gift. And I find that really what sustained me through this career in science. Have I had doubt about myself? You're going to be surprised if I tell you I doubted I was any good, I'm worth anything, I deserve any recognition, till I was about 50 years of age. And I should mention, I had gotten to the National Academies well before I was 50. But I had that doubt. For one reason or another, I really always doubted myself. And I'm thankful that I doubted myself, because for the last 10 to 15 years, it helped me so much, helped so many women become really successful scientists. My lab, I've always made a point of having 50-50. I find the women precious and the men precious, and when they're together, they can make magic in science, because the exchange of ideas on all the creativity. And often you get these stellar women, and they go on a job hunt, and they're like the best you've ever trained, and they come back after 3 or 4 visits. They didn't get that job. And then I have this man who's just wonderful, but maybe not as great as this woman. And he'll go on 3 job interviews, and he'll get all of them. And this is when I immediately reflected on myself and self-doubt. And I started really digging deep with my women trainees to figure out, what is it that they're not? So I would sit with them, pretend I'm the person interviewing on the other side. And I would watch their body language, how they're sitting, how they're presenting themselves, and so on and so forth. And I would immediately, revolt and encourage them to sit straight, encourage them to speak with confidence, and remind them how great they are. It's really that simple. That's really what we need to do to young women in science. It's innate. I think it's innate. I don't know. Some women in the room may disagree with me, but I felt it was in me, and I've seen it in almost every woman I trained. It's innate. We don't feel that confidence. We do have that self-doubt. And we need somebody to remind us. Art did tell me that. I didn't believe him. I mean, I walked out of his lesson. I honestly didn't believe it. I thought I'm going to falter. I'm going to fall on my face. And everything that happened, every success, I somehow attributed to some other chance occasion. Until one day, one of the Hughes presidents sat down with me, and he told me how much he believed in me and how much he was amazed and this and that. It took that for me. I was 50 by then, to believe I could really do it. That's why I do it now much, much earlier in the life of my trainees, and I find it very helpful. It does happen to men as well, but I've seen it more in women. It definitely happens to group who come from underrepresented group in science, who also have had less fortunate situation. I've seen that happen as well. So to me, these were the 2 big challenges: trying to figure life, being a scientist, a physician, and a mother and a wife, and juggling all that. Thankfully, I figured it with a lot of help, I should mention. I tell all my young trainees right now, if you want to be a scientist, focus on that. You cannot do everything. You have to hire people to help you do some of the things that you do not have to do yourself. And the second one is really the self-doubt. And I think the more we're cognizant of that, the more we can help a lot of women, because they are just as capable, but they are doubtful. I don't know how much more time I have. I probably passed my time, so I should be quiet and allow the next speaker to come forward. Thank you.
So my name is Michael Zilka, and Cullen Geiselman is my cousin. I asked Cullen for her resume so I could prepare for this introduction, and when it arrived, it became clear that focusing on just its highlights would eat up all of the time allotted to me. So instead, I'm going to focus on Cullen the person, rather than the BAT Ph.D., board member or chair of the Greater Houston Community Foundation, Houston Zoo, Houston Arboretum and Nature Center, the Houston Parks Board, the Houston Advanced Research Center, the Turtle Conservancy, the Lone Star Coastal Alliance, Bats Without Borders, the Rainforest Trust, and Bat Conservation International, where she is the immediate past chair. Cullen also sits on committees at the Menil, the Blaffer Art Museum, the Glassell School at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and was on the board of the Contemporary Arts Museum. I met Cullen properly in January 2011. She had returned to Houston after securing her Ph.D. at Columbia. She was interested in socially conscious investing, and I was involved with renewable energy. I was immediately impressed by how smart Cullen was, but especially taken by how alive, engaged, and caring she seemed. It's extraordinary to consider the mark she has made on Houston, based on all of the organizations listed above, in the 13 years she has been back. We became friends, and once Cullen agreed to join the board of the Turtle Conservancy in Ojai, I got to see firsthand why my wife Nina, who is on the Parks board with Cullen, would sing her praises as one of their most effective board members. Cullen's expertise is in bats, not turtles, but the governance skills she has acquired on all those boards makes her an essential component of our team. And although she doesn't know it, and after seeing her resume, I am concerned whether she will have the bandwidth, I have just been asked to see if she would chair our board. So Cullen is a powerhouse, but even more importantly, she is a fabulous person. And in March of last year, she married her soulmate, Robert Muse. Cullen is so accomplished that it was hard for her to find an equal partner, and 2 years ago that happened. Nina and I love hanging out, watching films, and going to hear music with Cullen and Robert. I know this event is focused on women in science, but I mention this because I think one of Cullen's greatest strengths is that she is such a full person with a rich and varied life, and I don't think she would be able to excel as a scientist if this weren't the case. So it is my pleasure to introduce Cullen, who will share some of the challenges she has faced as a woman in science.
I'm so thrilled to chat with you guys today, and because I have to say, it was my mentor has taught me too, that each picture is worth at least 1,000 words. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey to becoming a scientist and sort of how I got to this sort of not academic area of my life, which I doubted myself quite a lot until when you fail enough, then you're like, well, it's really not that bad. Anyway, so my journey and my passion really arose probably where it really got directed in high school. But as a small child, I was very focused on animals, and I was very mission-oriented. And there I am. I might be 5. My mom dug up this picture for me last night, and everywhere I went, had my hamster, and was really dedicated to all animals and all pets and everything, and was ready to go on a mission. But really, my directed journey focused on the environment, started with this woman. This is Catherine Leatham. She was my high school biology teacher at the Kincaid School, and she taught this class called Gulf Coast Crisis. And I'm not even sure at 15 if I even realized I lived in the Gulf Coast. I lived in Texas, and I'm not sure if I really understood where Houston was. I mean, in relation to, I hadn't really given a lot of thought. And we got to go on field trips, and the first field trip, the first morning, we get in the van, and she takes us to a BFI landfill and says, y'all, this is where your garbage goes. Next day, we went to a sewage treatment plant. This is what happens when you flush the toilet. And then throughout a 3-week course, she showed us like the environmental issues with our community and where they start and where they go and what that impact was. She also took us out to prairies and told us about native plants. And she just had such an impact on me. I had no idea. She opened my eyes. And that's what ultimately led me to my undergraduate degree, which was at Duke University and the Nicholas School of the Environment. I did a degree in environmental science and policy. And part of the reason I wasn't a biology major is so I didn't have to take physics, just to be totally honest. And I'm sure other students understand that. And but that was really where my passion was. And I had the joy of spending, one of the nice things about Duke University, pretty much all the juniors go abroad. Somehow they find a way to get you to go abroad. And I went to Costa Rica, and I I studied with the School of Field Studies, and I studied sustainable development. And that's where, walking through tropical forests, I just looked up and I was like, it's trees, it's plants. And I really got interested in botany. I really thought this is where I really wanted to be. But I also spent a summer, I'm from Houston, I spent a summer working for free at the Houston Zoo while I was in college. And here I am in my little Houston Zoo outfit. I kind of look different, but not totally. And working in the world of primates, I got to be really close to animals. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I cut up a lot of fruit all day and I clean up a lot of poo, and I could do this. That could be a career choice. But I had a really hard time getting direction from from what I could do as a career. And I was really sort of bouncing around. I could be a scientist, maybe not. What else was I going to do? I got my first paid internship down in Clear Lake at the Environmental Institute of Houston, studying outdoor classrooms and how students engage with the outdoors in school and cataloging those. And that was pretty interesting. And then ultimately, I landed a job after I graduated from undergrad with Bat Conservation International. Totally random. It was not botany. I got rejected. I wrote all these letters to botanical gardens and I couldn't get a job. So, but that was fine. I was young. I was like, sure, I can do this. I can teach people about bats. I have to always show a couple good pictures of bats. 80% of all the bats in the world are insectivorous. And over a fifth of all mammal species are bats, and they're doing cool stuff like specializing on eating frogs. And there's a bat in Costa Rica, or fully carnivorous bats that eat birds and other bats. And then the bats that I studied, those that disperse seeds in the rainforest, or that are like little hummingbirds and pollinate plants. And Bat Conservation International let me, at 22 to 26 years old, go all around the world teaching people about bats. I taught workshops, taught people how to study bats and do all this stuff. And here I am in Kenya, and this is a very old photo and sort of hard to see in this light. And I have a little bat. We all wear gloves and masks now. But back then we did not. We handled them and did all sorts of stuff. Only very special people get to see pictures of me holding bats barehanded. But that other guy next to me is Peter Taylor, and he was a Ph.D. scientist that they flew up from South Africa because I didn't have the credentials to actually go around and tell people, oh, we really caught this bat and not that bat, because I wasn't a specialist in African bat taxonomy. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then the next year, I got to go to Brazil. And I went on a really interesting trip to Brazil where we went to these cattle ranches and places right along what they call the Arc of Destruction, where they're cutting down the Amazon forest, burning it, and putting cattle into pastures, and then shipping them off to China in the end, or their body parts, for people to eat. And these fires, it reminded me so much of all the things I studied with Catherine Leatham back in high school, and was like, oh my God. I was also reading this book at the time called The Song of the Dodo, and it's about island biogeography in our time of extinctions. And this author is fantastic. He's a new board member with me on a board, and I'm nearly passed out when I first got to meet him. But he wrote all about these amazing scientists and the work they did and how it all added up to this amazing interest, like people in the Amazon, people in Papua New Guinea, all over the world, studying animals, studying how humans impact on the environment. And it was really compelling. And then later that year, I got to be in Brazil in the Rio Negro for work. I was co-leading a trip with the New York Botanical Garden and Bat Conservation International, looking at bats as a natural history tour. And I met this man who later became my PhD advisor. This is Scott Morey, who was the chair of systematic botany at the New York Botanical Garden. And he was looking for a student that knew something about bats and can capture bats and identify bats. And he was ready to take me on. He said, you get to choose. I'm affiliated with a number of universities. I'm adjunct at 3 in New York. You choose what school you want to go to. And I chose to go to Columbia. And it was a new department, the Ecology, Evolution, Environmental Biology department. And what was so interesting to me about this, instead of doing a PhD in 6 years, which you do your master's and PhD, you got to add a 7th year and study environmental policy, environmental law, economics of the environment, and because they had decided at Columbia that they were tired of trying to teach science to policymakers and that maybe we should just teach some policymaking to scientists and maybe they would step up and do some policy work. And I office at the New York Botanical Garden with my PhD advisor. And I didn't get to go to Brazil and the Arc of Destruction to study bats and whatnot. I got to go to French Guiana, which I didn't know where that was. It's in northern South America. And it's where my PhD advisor had been working with many, many people for many years to write the vascular plants of central French Guiana. That man knows every plant in central French Guiana. And he said, this is going to be easier if you want to study bats and plants. And this is where my work is. So you'll be working here. And it was a really amazing place. We went to this research station called the Neurological Research Station, and it's run by essentially their National Science Foundation, the CNRS, and it was pretty rudimentary. The accommodation, it is truly in a rainforest, a lowland rainforest, and there was nobody for 100 miles around, just forest. And you got to helicopter there because that was way better than taking a 2-hour bus from Cayenne and an 8-hour boat ride up the river with no shade and then an 8-kilometer hike with all your things up to the research station, 30 minutes in a helicopter. It's my favorite mode of transportation now. It's great. There we are unloading the helicopter at the research station, and we live pretty basically. Hammocks. There was no toilet. We did have some running water. And this was the other thing that I really wanted to do. And I'm not sure if I ever really meant it to. I just wanted to live deep in the rainforest and just really be with nature. And you really start changing your mind about that because nature itches. And it's humid and you're sticky all the time and you smell bad all the time. And anyway, you learn that that's different. But I really did get to see a lot of nature while I was there. And I was there. I was doing my PhD research, which was I was studying actually there are 4 species of sympatric, meaning they all live together in the same place. Glossophagian, meaning they have long tongues and look like little hummingbirds, types bats that lived in this pristine rainforest. Why were there 4 species that look essentially just alike? These are only 3. There was one that's very rare that was never captured. They essentially, you can kind of see them, just alike. What are they all doing there, and what are they doing something different? And so I spent a lot of time, 4 o'clock in the morning, by myself in the middle of nowhere in the rainforest, catching bats in mist nets, sort of like bird nets. And I'd put them in little bags. They would poop, and then I could look at their poop under a microscope and see what kind of pollen it was from my pollen collection that I identified using that fancy book that my PhD advisor and all his colleagues had written. And I did that for 2 years. I also did stuff like get into the canopy to find out most of these bats, like where were they going? Where were these flowers? And so here I am, and I started thinking about while I was doing all this hardcore work, when I was younger, I really thought, you know what? I want to meet Indiana Jones, and I'm going to marry him. I wanted to be her. But you know what? I'm dangling off a tree, and I was like, screw her. I'm him. And I became him. And then little Cully came back, and I was like, you know what? I don't need an Indiana Jones. I can do this myself, and here I am, doing it and doing a lot of studies. And I'm going to skip past this because I'm going to run out of time. This is a film of me, the actual film that we took in that tree of a bat going to this plant. But it's about an hour or a minute of just some. I don't know how well. Well, we can try, actually. Let's see. Do y'all want to see? Y'all want to see what this looks like? A bat coming to a plant? Let's see. Where's my mouse? Oh, it's going. They started it for me. So those little things where the arrow is that look like green beans, those are flowers, and they're popping open. This is in light that is, I have my special light on it so we can actually see it at night. It's sort of in an infrared. And literally 4 minutes after the flower opens, a bat arrives. That's a bat. They move really fast. And then there's little movement, and those are ants. They're going to, and so, oh, the bat's back. Don't worry, I'm gonna slow it down here in a second. Oh, moving fast, moving fast. He'll come back. Imagine many, many hours of this, like hundreds. So here's the slow-mo. There he is. There he is. I had some lovely students. 3 different students watch hundreds of hours of that for some studies. And then y'all are be real excited about what we learned. What we learned is that these bats, these 2 bats that look very similar, they're slightly different in size. Well, they're pretty much eating very much similar. These are plant species on the y-axis, or on the x-axis of what they're eating. There are a few things that are slightly different, but generally, these bats are generally doing the same thing. I looked at it over time. Well, sometimes there's 80% overlap in their diet. Sometimes there's only 30%, but they're kind of doing the same thing. And then I was like, well, maybe there's just a lack of fit. Like maybe the bigger bat, like this guy, he can stick his nose in those flowers, the more on the left side, the bell-shaped flowers, and maybe the little one can't. Or maybe the little one just really likes this. It went multiple times whenever this particular caryocar plant flowered. It went there, it seemed. At least that's what I found from this. Could be flower constancy. Could be foraging behavior. The little bats seemed to mainly be focusing on plants that were found above the canopy. Most of stuff I could not see because I only had so many cameras up and looking at it. And so I decided to really look at this plant. It was the dominant tree species, Epiruta falcata. It doesn't really have a real name. It was the main food group in the dry season, right there. And both bats are feeding on it all the time, and lots of other things turned out where. And it has this pretty flower. There they are, dangling down. And so up 100 feet in the canopy, we decided to cover up some of these flowers and keep some nocturnal visitors away and some diurnal visitors away. And then we also were filming the plants. And we wanted to see what would set fruit, depending on what visitors came. So this is very hard for you to see because it was very hard for my students to see when they were looking at all this video. Hummingbirds came to the plants, moths came to the plants. That lump in the middle, D, that's a monkey. We're coming to these plants. And then we got the data, and guess what? Everybody's coming to these plants. They're one of the main things out there. Bees, bats, hummingbirds, they're all sort of seem to be coming to these plants. Looked at the fruiting success of the plants based on, was it pollinated during the day or during the night, or did we just pollinate it with itself? Well, everybody's kind of making fruit. And so the big takeaways to my research was that these bats are feeding on similar things all the time, but maybe in differently proportions, somewhat. And then the dominant plant that they're visiting actually doesn't rely on them for pollination. And so nature is just a big old mess. It's a lot easier to do this in the lab, and it's also a lot easier to not do it by yourself. And so my Ph.D. advisor's work that I was also doing, well, that got done. We wrote a book, Seed Dispersal by Bats in the Neotropics. That happened. And here my co-author and my Ph.D. advisor are on one of our trips, and our big takeaways from a 300-page book are bats are important seed dispersers in the Neotropics. But how they are important and where, it's just kind of different. And I had all this great data. I was going to do a bunch of other stuff. I tried to do 3 different postdocs. First guy didn't get tenure, left Rice. The other woman came up from Mexico and brought her children, though her husband didn't appreciate that. So she got in trouble for kidnapping, and then she couldn't be here anymore. And then the #1 bat biologist in the world that was at Boston University, he took me on to do a postdoc, and we were going to study bat seed dispersal in India as ecosystem services. He literally got hit by a car. And then I stopped trying to do all that stuff. But what I did have was my family in Houston. So during all this time, I'd moved back to Houston for these knuckleheads because I lived here, and it was better than the Bronx at the time because the Bronx in the winter's kind of rough. And I took over what my mom had been doing a long time, the Cullen Trust for Healthcare, which is a supporting organization that funds healthcare initiatives in the greater Houston area. And they've done a lot of work. And she said, "You're going to love this." And I was like, "Well, Mom, can't it just be like environmental health care? And she said, no. And because that's not what we do. And so I really got deep into healthcare. I learned a lot about healthcare. I got to ask a lot of questions. And I got to work on my database, which is what I inherited from my PhD advisor about all those bat-plant interactions. Well, it's become all sorts of interactions. It's become bat interactions, not just with plants, but where bats live. What eats bats? What lives on bats? Look at that scary thing. Anyhow, and this is in my database, and we've expanded it, and it became very popular during the pandemic because the coronavirus that has now infected and become a human-dominated disease was actually evolved from one that came out of bats. And my database of all these interactions with bats and all these other things and where they live and what they do, well, people said, this is interesting. And now I have all these collaborators. I have people working with me all the time. And so this work that I've been doing for 20 years on my own now actually has a pretty big audience and is really beginning to take off. So you never really know. So now, as Michael explained, I sit on a lot of boards. And I've learned this from chairing the board of the Cullen Trust for Healthcare. And I chaired the board, Bat Conservation International Board, after having been a staff person. You know a lot when you've been a staff person, then you become a board member, and really helped get that organization going in a good direction post-founder. I've served on the Houston Zoo Board after all that great zoo poo cleaning and everything that I did in college, and we've turned that from a place for family entertainment into the largest environmental educator in the state of Texas. And the number of kids that come and get a conservation message at the zoo is incredible. I have just recently rolled off as being chair of the board of the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. And they really didn't need me though I give bat walks there, they didn't really need me for my scientific prowess, but I knew a lot about boards at this point. I serve on the HARC board, which is just up in the Woodlands. And that's been pretty interesting. And this was not my plan. We have a new board that might finally take off after 12 years, the Lone Star Coastal Alliance. We want to create a national recreation area in the Galveston Bays, and it might just start happening. As Michael said, I serve with his wife Nina on the Houston Parks Board, and we are bringing park equity across Houston with the Bayou Greenways and with our investment in neighborhood parks that have not been invested in a long time. And I serve with Michael on the Turtle Conservancy Board, and I'll show you a picture in just a moment, and you'll see my contribution to diversity on that board. And now recently Rainforest Trust. So there's rainforests in Costa Rica that I loved and really opened my mind. I'm now with a group and directing about $50 million worth of funding every year to save our rainforest for humans and for nature. So here I am with the Turtle Conservancy Board, and I was their diversity first woman on the board, and everyone listened to me. I feel like I don't have a whole lot of challenges. My biggest challenge was self-doubt in many different ways. And I'm also short. In most of the boards I was on, I was the youngest person, and I was a woman, and I'm like 5 feet nothing. And so when you have someone say, you need to do blah, 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 and they hear, I think she just might have suggested that perhaps that we might consider, and I'm like, no, you need to blah, blah, blah. You need to do your audit, or you need to blah, blah, whatever. And but I have to say that I've learned a lot about turtles on this turtle board. And on the zoo board, what we've realized is that conservation, and maybe this is what I didn't really need to probably get a PhD. I learned a lot, and people do like to see that Cullen Geiselman Muse, Ph.D, is coming to talk to them, and they respect me. But what we found at the Houston Zoo, this is me on a panel at the American Zoological Association conference, and we talked about culture and conservation culture, and there's not one conservationist up there. I was a zoo board member. We had the director of admissions, director of advancement, and the director of HR. And guess what? All of this work requires everyone working together. And every single one of us up there is a conservationist. Even though I happen to have the PhD, every single one of us is doing the work. And it takes all kinds. It takes HR to get this done. And so here I am at the zoo back in my day. And then I got the joy of co-chairing their capital campaign for $150 million. And if you haven't been to the zoo in a while, you should go. It's not far away from here. And here it is, the Pantanal, some of the same places I was in Brazil. And we have a new wonderful exhibit highlighting these wonderful people, true conservationists from the country of origin in Brazil. They didn't need an American. This is the world's largest living armadillo. Weighs like 60 pounds. Lives in the Pantanal. You can't see it at the Houston Zoo, only a statue. They don't do well in captivity. Anyway, it's been a joy and a real interest in doing all this. And most recently, I have fused and it's just someone just asked me to do it. And I did it. My love of wildlife and the environment with human health. And we published a book called One Health in the Exposome. And again, I feel like I'm a good relayer of information to people to engage them in science. And my ability to do science in nature is really hard. And the results that you get, people don't want to publish in a really good journal, which is not really good for your academic career. But it doesn't have to be academia. And I'm just going to leave you with that. So.
It is my pleasure to introduce Aleida Rios, a 1991 graduate in chemical engineering of Texas A&M. She's a senior vice president of engineering at BP, responsible for 2,500 engineers and director of BP's Global Engineering Center. In recognition of her outstanding career, she's been elected to the Royal Society of Engineers. She moved to Houston from Mexico as a child, and although she didn't speak English fluently, she spoke math fluently. And a high school teacher who happened to be a chemical engineer suggested that she study engineering. She's motivated now by two big challenges. The first, of bringing energy to the world to improve people's quality of life and to maintain our quality of life. And the second, to inspiring and developing a diverse workforce so that women no longer run the risk of being hidden figures. Our modern way of life depends on energy, as of now, primarily from fossil fuels. But climate change makes it essential we increasingly decarbonize our energy systems. And while large improvements in the production of solar and wind energy have occurred in the past 10 years, much, much more is needed. Engineering is built on breakthroughs, and Aleida Rios is intent on leveraging the current capabilities of BP and oil and gas production to help produce the innovations needed to reduce our carbon output. Aleida?
Yes, thank you, Virginia. Wow, how do you follow those amazing ladies, Huda and Cullen? And actually, I was talking to Virginia before we gathered, and she has an amazing story. If you haven't heard it, it's she led the way for me to even be here standing in front of you. I also decided on pictures, because I figured by the time you hear from three people talking, you know, it's easier to say your story in pictures. So I also chose a few pictures to just talk about who I am. But I wanted to start first with who I am. It's actually not that bio or those things that are written on papers or those accomplishments that you hear about. It's really where I came from. And the first, let's see, I think I have the slides. Yeah, so that's really, I want to talk a little bit about where I came from. You know, I was an immigrant to the U.S. Many people here in Houston come from that background. But yeah, I stepped into a classroom. Well, first of all, I'll say I stepped into Dallas and it was too cold for us Mexicans. So we came down south, and that's the truth. But anyway, I stepped into a classroom in Houston where actually at that time, you know, there wasn't very many people that spoke Spanish. I know that seems odd in a city like Houston, but it really was not many people spoke Spanish. And so my name, thank you, Virginia, is Aleida Rios. That's what my mom calls me. But here in Houston, I'm often called Aleida Rios because that's the way the teacher pronounced my name. And an 8-year-old that doesn't speak English is not going to be trying to correct a teacher. So that's where I started from. But I want to talk about that a little bit because that also built a lot of resilience in being different, in knowing what that feels like and understanding how do then I overcome challenges. But anyway, so I came into Houston from Mexico. And then my inspiration, oftentimes I'm asked, so what was your inspiration for engineering? I had no idea what engineering was. No idea. I know you step into Houston, how could you not? But my parents came from energy poverty in Mexico. We grew up very happy. By the way, we didn't know what energy poverty was. We were happily, but there was only 5th grade education. Because with energy, with accessibility to energy, you also get education, you also get so many things that we have that we enjoy. Well, my parents came to the U.S. because they wanted education for their children. That's the reason. So obviously, what I knew was I needed to get an education. Of course, my dad was a little worried because I couldn't make tortillas. And I couldn't cook. So my mom says, we came to here because the girls are going to study. And my dad was like, who's going to marry them? They don't know how to cook. And my mom would say, they're going to be able to buy the tortillas and the tamales. And that's what they're going to do. So anyway, so Texas A&M University came, I should say before Texas A&M University, Houston has a great, great education system that we need to protect. I know we talk a lot about education, but it's so important that we protect the education system that we're providing here. I am a product of that education system. So I went to Milby High School, which, by the way, was petrochemical careers. It's now math and science, but it was petrochemical careers at that time. And I had a teacher that you mentioned that came from, like Virginia, came from industry, and that told me, you need to study engineering. I said, I don't know what that is, but I could use a job. So she got me a job, an internship at the refinery, at Shell Refinery in down in Pearland. So anyway, I went there, and that's how I ended up at A&M. I basically applied to engineering and got a scholarship, and later I'll tell you why I chose chemical engineering in particular. But Texas A&M was my home. The other thing I want to talk about is, a lot of times I think anybody that knows me knows my boys. And it was nice that Virginia actually said, and you have 3 boys. And yeah, and one of the biggest accomplishments and who I am was, and you mentioned your children as well and the challenges. I've faced similar challenges, but one of my biggest accomplishments is my middle son, Gabriel, just graduated civil engineering at Texas A&M. And there's a legacy there, and we're giving back because we want more and more underrepresented groups in engineering, women and minorities and ethnic minorities. We really care for that. My husband, Ed, is also a big part of why I do what I do. He came from a working mother. His mother was an entrepreneur that basically in San Antonio had beauty salons. And sometimes people ask me, well, why you do what you do? Because I actually had a husband who grew up with those symbols and that ability to see and believe and support me. And now I have 3 boys that are going to be amazing, amazing husbands for working women. So anyway, my oldest, Anthony, is in finance economics. My husband has always dual career. We always worked. And anyway, they always came to work with me. That's another thing. I could never physically have them there, but that's a come bring your children to work day. They always knew that what I was doing mattered. It wasn't more important than them. And that's really who we are and where we come from. And it's really not all those things you read and the accomplishments and all that kind of stuff. But I will talk a little bit about my career in energy. So the next, this is just pictures again. And I wanted to just talk about the amazing amount of innovation that has occurred around in technology innovation that I've seen in the energy. This is the energy capital of the world, and we've seen it. We've seen what it's brought. We've explored in deep water, which, by the way, I know we talk about health, which you've heard a lot about already here today. And obviously, I come from the energy industry. But the other place that's really bounded, that lives here in Houston is space exploration. And let me tell you, that exploring in deep water, Gulf of Mexico, deep water, period, is like going to the moon. And it is so much fun. I have so much fun. You say that, that was driving you, getting up in the morning. I could not leave my boys and come to work if I wasn't having fun. But those challenges, today we're working with digital twins, we're working with robotics, we're working with creating a new energy system that is so needed. So the challenges what drove me to be an engineer. It really is about facing challenges, working together to provide solutions to improve the world and the world that we're in. So that was really a lot of what I gained from that. But one of the other things that I really have gained is just being visible, being able to have young girls. So the other thing I do a lot is go to schools and talk to students, and being able to actually just be present, be in the rooms that many times Virginia had the pathway for me, but just realizing that you're creating a pathway everywhere you go. And so the work that I do is not just the day work, the day job, is really also about creating opportunities for others. Some of the biggest thing that I can remember, I've already talked about my son in the engineering, but this picture of Royal Academy of Engineering is in 2021, I received the International Fellowship from the Royal Academy of Engineers. They elect only 50 every year, and the International Fellowship in the UK is given to just about 4 or 5, and they asked me to apply, or they nominated me for the application, and I looked at the previous winners, and I said, these are all like, these are like Nobel Peace Prize, all this. And I was like, that's not me. Why me? And actually, it turned out that, engineers are in all parts and pieces, and we all matter. And what they really wanted to recognize is the engineers that have an impact on everyday life. And the recognition that applied engineering is really, really important. And so anyway, I was elected at the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK, and I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy, and I really enjoy meeting some amazing engineering fellows that have done incredible pieces of work. So anytime I step into a university like Rice University, or I go to the fellowship, or I walk into any academic area, I just think, wow, if we could just give this education potential to everybody that we touch, what would the world be like? Because these universities, it's not just engineering or really about solving problems. We as engineers are doing that. The access to women, to having more women in engineering is big for me. So 40% of the female engineers, chief engineers, the 40% of the chief engineers now at BP are women. And why? Because I became the head of engineering, plain and simple. Plain and simple, and I can tell you they were there before I came. Plain and simple. And today we also have 46% of all the new engineers that are coming into BP of female, because they're there. So it is intentional. It is intentional what we do with our privilege, and that's really, really important to me. And those are really the biggest accomplishments I can say. I can talk about all the technology stuff, things that wake me up and get me up in the morning, and then why I'm an engineer. But the real things that matter are what differences I can make for underrepresented groups in engineering. But in terms of I should say that the one thing that I didn't mention is it was all so scary. All of it. Every morning I get up and I say, what am I going to do today? If I'm scared, go for it. So one of the things that I wish I'd done more often is actually gone for the things that scared me. So I loved your stories because it was like, oh my God, you did that? Oh my God, but that's really, really important. So I know I see some young women in the audience today, go for the things that scare you. If you get that little thing in the pit of your stomach, but you love to do it, go for it, because it is kind of how the things that I've managed to do that really scared me were the ones that grew me the most and made the biggest difference. But our paths are very, very, they're just, who knows? You start out your path and you really don't know. But there's a couple of things that isn't straightforward, but there are a couple of things that I look back at my 25-year-old self and said, I wish I'd known this, or somebody had told me this. And there's a couple of things that for me were really important. At the bottom, I talk a lot about, and I heard it in your stories, just how important it is to get in the field, to do that technical work, to really understand I've been in over 30 years. I've always said the last 15 years of my career were built on the first 15. And if I hadn't done that frontline work, my very first job was on this is what they were called, a gang truck. It was an oil field truck that basically had 5 different disciplines on the truck because everything was pneumatic and you had to have it all electrician, mechanical, you had to have everybody. And I was the one that picked up the trash. And, you had to paint, you had to have everything on that truck. But that's where I started. Do you know what my dad thought about me going out to the oil fields of West Texas to get in a truck to go out and clean up well sites? Well, it was scary. It was scary, but we have to do that work. But the fact that I did a lot of that frontline job. The following job was in a plant in West Texas, No Trees, Texas. And there really wasn't any trees there. But anyway, and then that's where my dad really got scared that I was never going to get married. But anyway, those frontline jobs teach you, obviously, the technical skills. Obviously, those all are hugely important. And I do talk a lot about that technical depth and that know-how, especially for women, because we do have to do it. Virginia and I talked about this in our chat. You just have to you just have to do it better. Because if somebody's always looking at something that isn't going to go right. And then they question, why did it not go right? So really building that credibility and the depth is really important. But the other thing it taught me is resilience. So we talk a lot about technical, but what you also learn is some character skills that are really, really important. How to work with people, how to ask for help, how to be scared and overcome that, how to be resilient. And those are the things that actually really propel me to keep going for those things that scared me, because you will make mistakes, you will get, setbacks, you will feel self-doubt every day, all day, but just overcoming that every day as well really builds that resilience. So the last 15 years, I always tell people, that bottom looks really small, but that's where the depth was. That's where everything occurred the first, 10 to 12 years. By the way, I was also having children at that time. So I was either trying to get pregnant, after maternity leave, breastfeeding, or trying to, have the third. So yeah, if you think about 3 years, 3 kids, 2 years apart, 10 years. They were either they were here, or here, But they always came to work with me. I always brought them to work with me. But I also had my husband who helped me a lot, my mother, my comadres, my tribe, my community. But then the other thing, after I've done that, I think it's, Cullen also said it is really important. You also build some breadth. So I got some finance experience, some commercial experience, some strategy. Even though I knew engineering was what I wanted to do, I also knew that to be a better problem solver, I needed some of that breadth. So I did that, and then after that, it's boring. Then it's all the VP jobs and all the SVP jobs. That part is boring. The fun part about that part is that you have more impact. You can have more impact on people in the way that you go about doing those jobs. And so that's the biggest thing about my VP. By the way, I was VP of operations in the Gulf of Mexico after Macondo. So, it was rebuilding an organization. It was onshore operations when we were turning off the lights because we didn't think we were going to have enough gas. So, yeah, all those years were really important, but all those years were really about people and people's potential. And that's what's been fun about the executive roles. And then, so now what keeps me here? What keeps me kind of in this after 30 years, it's actually climate. So I have really honestly, in 2020, when we actually in BP reimagined, we called it Reimagining BP for people on the planet. But what that was is the science is real. The science is here. There's no denying it, and it's everyone's problems. And the energy companies of the world have to solve it, because I don't think we're giving up. I haven't seen anybody give up too much of what we have. But the most important thing on that is we also can't leave anybody behind while we create these solutions. So the world does need lower carbon, but they also need it to be secure, and we need it to be affordable, because it needs to be affordable to be insecure and low carbon, because we cannot leave anybody behind in this problem. And today, it's an amazing time to be an engineer, and I'm super excited about that, because I've always said, and being energy is about improving people's life, and I think there isn't a more important time in our lifetime than to actually solve climate. So that's kind of what keeps me here. So the challenges, it is pretty scary, and trust me, these podiums, every time you talk about climate and you happen to work for an oil company, you know? It's not necessary. I've never taken a role because it was popular. I've taken a role because it mattered. And I am super, super excited about what Houston has meant in energy, what we've been able to accomplish, and what the future challenges are for us in the world, and we need to solve it. The final thing I wanted to talk about was really needing to have more females pursuing STEM and STEM careers, and I'm glad we're having this conversation today, because I do think it's hugely important that the underrepresented groups have access, and we create that space, because the innovation that we need to solve some of these problems is pretty important. But I wanted to have a few messages to those that are thinking about it or considering it, just things that I would tell my 25-year-old self. And I think some of them have already come up, so I'll just summarize. I wrote to myself, "You are enough." And it's really hard to say that when you grew up with self-doubt, but don't let anyone tell you it isn't for you or you're not enough. Love it first, of course. If you're not doing something you don't love, please go find something else. You have to love it, but you are enough, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Failures and challenges, embrace them. Don't be so hard on yourself. That's your greatest growing opportunities. I love my failures. I do hate it when it happens, but getting myself back up from the ground and from those failures and from the challenges, it's a yogi thing. If you can get yourself up without using your hands until you're 80, that's my goal. So yes, challenges and failures are just opportunities. Ask for help. I didn't talk enough about the tribes of people that have helped me. I'm not just talking about my mentors and my coaches at work. I'm talking about my husband. I'm talking about my comadres. I'm talking about my mother. I'm talking about my father, who actually died from Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So I love the work that we're doing. So yes, but I asked for a lot of help. I'm talking about that logistic manager that actually brought me a refrigerator, because he happened to ask me, "Why do you need a refrigerator, young lady?" And I said, well, because I'm breastfeeding and I need to store my breast milk so we can ship it. He goes, "I'll be the first one to ship your breast milk." So he's part of the asking for help. So my final message to female engineers, less so about the 25-year-old, is there's more of us now. We have made progress. And so therefore, it's now our job to also help each other. So it's not just males anymore that need to help. It's all of us need to support and help each other. So I've never had the myth of women not supporting women is a myth. And I do believe that the only difference was there wasn't enough of us. Now there is in STEM, so now we can do more with our privilege and give back. And I do believe that that's a big part of what I need to do, and I ask all of us to do that collectively. So that's it. I think we're going to have a conversation now, right? Thank you.
Oh, we have questions. So what an extraordinary evening this really is. I can't remember an occasion, and we've had many wonderful civic science lectures and panels and so forth, but I can't remember an occasion in which we've had a diversity of ideas and experiences and advice that we've had this evening. So I want to start by congratulating this panel. We have a number of questions, and I want to get to as many as I can. Many are coming in from people who are watching us online who somehow don't like the weather change, I guess. Did anyone along the line tell you, you can't do this? You can't be an engineer, you can't be a scientist, can't be a math? Did that ever happen? One reads stories of women who've had that sort of experience. And often what's emphasized in the article is it only takes one event like that to turn a person's career totally off. Did any of you ever experience that? Did you just say, nonsense, I don't care, I mean, I'm going to do it anyway. You're just strong enough in will. I think Huda indicated maybe you had questions of your own abilities early on and had to wrestle with them. But anybody have a personal experience where a teacher, parent, relative said, "This is not for you. Don't go down this road"?
Well, you know, and you might think, well, that happened early in your career. And actually, it wasn't that long ago, maybe about 8 years ago. I got into an elevator with actually a pretty senior person, and there was a few of us in there, and they said, "How did you get here?" And I said, you know, well, on I-10, and there was a lot of traffic, and you know, went about my conversation. And you might have thought, as you probably did right now, that I did that on purpose. I actually didn't. Later, my colleague who was in the elevator came up to me and said, "How could you have had that happen?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, he was talking about, how did you get to be head of engineering? And I said, "Seriously?" I said, well, I would have told him a thing or two. But, you know, sometimes I think we have to. I don't know how you guys have felt, but I think you talked about naivety. I think that's been kind of a shield. And I'm not going to say that it has to be that way, because I have felt it the other times where people have questioned, you know, my abilities for just being a woman. But I think in most cases you have to brush it off, and you have to just kind of dig in within yourself.
Anybody else have such an experience?
I had a terrible experience with everybody telling me, "You'll never find the Rett syndrome gene.
Yeah.
Give it up." Because the technology wasn't there to find the gene for a disease that's not inherited, that's purely sporadic. So I heard, "You will never succeed, you will never do that," for 16 years. That was tough, but I learned quite a good lesson. So that it had nothing to do with me being a woman. I think they would have told that to a man. No man will touch that. No man would have worked maybe on it. But that was really the biggest, you know, challenge I faced, I would say.
Was there a moment somebody just said something that turned you around the other way? I mean, any of you, just a teacher, a friend, I mean, someone that just said the right thing at the right time, maybe when you're very small or maybe later. It made some person that made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Cullen?
Well, I've been very lucky, and she's in the audience. My mom has always been very supportive.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so she was never said, even when she, "My daughter's moving to the Bronx." French Guiana was better in her mind. Sorry for those that grew up in I love the Bronx. But she was very supportive of all of what I was doing and didn't tell me it was crazy. But she always said, "You're going to do something. Like, you're not going to just sit around and do nothing. Like, just whatever, live life." No, you were going to go do something.
Hey, Mom, hold up your hand.
Oh, yes.
And your mom's mom. Right? Yeah. So, ever a time when you thought this job's going to be easier if I were a man? I mean, I'm having problems getting this done, and I'm convinced that my problems are more difficult because I'm a woman. If I were a man, I'd not have difficulty dealing with that. Anybody have that experience? I'm not asking any of you want to be a man.
No. I honestly have never compared myself that way. I mean, and I certainly have felt like it's been unfair getting treated a certain way, but I never thought a man could do this better than me, except for maybe having, you know, except for the exception of mom, being a mom, because I do think we're better. But I do think your point is spot on, which is sometimes we can get biases, and we're all biased. So that's what I would say, is we all, you know, so yeah, oftentimes there could be a bias towards men can do something better because they're physically or for whatever reason.
I'm going to go a question back. Was there a person who really changed your life at a special moment? I didn't go into my history. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon.
Yeah.
Thought life was paradise there until the civil war erupted, destroyed the country. And my parents insisted I come here for a summer because it was quite dangerous, and got stuck here. So it was, I started medical school at the American University of Beirut, and I couldn't return, and ended up having to find a medical school here in October when it was too late. Long story short, Meharry Medical College was the only school that took me so late into, and it's an African American medical school. Had great education there, did very well, top scores, but when I looked at residency, nobody will take me. I spent time at Stanford. They told me I was better than any of their students, but likely they won't take me into their residency program. So after rejection at every medical school I applied to for residency, I'm visiting Baylor, doing an elective here, and Ralph Feigen calls me into his office. And he talks to me, he goes, "What can I do to get you here?" And I looked at him, he was young, 37-year-old. And I looked at him, I said, "Are you kidding, Dr. Feigen?" And he said, "I'm damn serious." And the rest is history. I came to Baylor, and as much as all the medical school who rejected me tried really hard with millions and millions of dollars to get me back, I said, "You didn't take a chance on me then." So I thought this story is important to tell. Ralph Feigen really became my American father.
It's a great story. One of our, a member of our audience wants to know what advice you give to young women who wish to be scientists and engineers, STEM fields, but also maybe thinking about leadership positions. Often I think scientists don't think about them being in a leadership position when they're starting out, but what would you say? I mean, I ask this in the context of something I worry about these days. Young people are not very optimistic about their future, sort of period. Men, women, a lot of articles, the boys are not all right. Well, that's a whole topic for another discussion. What does that mean? So are there things that you can think about in your own experience or your knowledge base now that would allow you to say something encouraging to these young people who really don't think they have the same kind of future that perhaps we did, you did, even with all the challenges you faced? The world is a mess. How would you encourage and advise a young person these days who interested perhaps in a career in science and engineering, technology of some other area, but maybe also who has a sense they would like to do more beyond? Can you really see beyond your own early career?
I would say be curious and know that probably this was probably not where you were planning to be when you were young. Neither of you. You were probably not thinking, "Oh, this is where I'm shooting for, that exact position at BP." Like you were not thinking that. And be okay with where, I mean, it's sort of a mix of chance and then persistence. But be
If it's
curious.
scary, do it.
Yeah, and if you love it. Yes. So that's the other thing is all of it will feel scary, especially when you can't see beyond, what's in front of you, and none of us really can. But I do think I should say find what you love. I love the getting up in the morning, leaving something behind. All of us, do that when we go to work. It can't be work. It's got to be love. And leadership is love, because you're in service of something bigger, greater. So yeah, just love what you do, and the rest of it will work itself out.
I actually encourage everyone who comes in my path to go into science, because I think it's the most rewarding career. And I honestly believe today, much more so than when I started my career, it's so perfect to get into science, because the technology, the things at our fingertips. To give you an idea, what took me 16 years to do, you can do it today in 4 hours. If I chose to clone the Rett syndrome gene today, I would have done it today in 4 hours. Can you imagine that? That's how much the technology has changed. So I tell them, what's fun is you can do so much now because so many advances have happened. And there's really no better feeling than knowing you're doing something that's going to enhance knowledge, change the environment, change health, do something so meaningful. So to me, I don't know, I feel my job is a gift. So I encourage them to do the same.
How gifted do you really have to be a successful scientist? Suppose you made a B in calculus. Is there some way to think about, when you're trying to encourage young people, it's very easy for a young person to be discouraged because they struggled with calculus or they struggled with biochemistry, for God's sakes. Terrible experience. So, is there room for the less gifted?
There's room for so many people in science. At least I can speak about science. Mostly because it's not only heads, it's heads and hands. And there are people who are greater in the head department, and there are people who are greater in the hands department. I know people whose hands really make microscopes sing almost, the way they produce these beautiful data and images. So I think there is, if you really like it and if you are curious and you want to contribute to that field of knowledge and health, you can do it.
Yeah, and I think we need to create different pathways to get to where we've gotten to. And traditionally it was the pathway of these difficult subjects that if you didn't have somebody at home to help you or a tutor, that was going to be hard to make that A and get to that, university. So, we're also looking at converting, technicians and apprentices into engineers and go into different universities because we want to have different, not just people, but different pathways to get to these fields because it'll create a much more broader context around solving problems. So you raise a really good point about, does everybody have to get an A from the toughest university to be, in these places? And we need to change that.
And it's a collaboration, and people with good people skills can get a lot more done. My trying to do it all by myself was a bad idea. We needed an army.
I really wonder if we're not putting ourselves and young people through a system that's been created a long time ago with traditions and places for failure that aren't really failure or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Maybe there's room for reforms along the way. I'm 85 years old, so maybe I can say we didn't do it right, totally right.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I created a program at BP called BP Bridge, which is actually taking, students from underrepresented, schools that basically would never get into, honestly, into Texas A&M, into Rice, into Duke, into Columbia, and really creating bridges for them to go into industry without having to go through that path. And so I do think that we need to look at the whole system, because if we don't fix the system, I don't think we're going to be able to increase the pipeline.
And I think Cullen said the magic word, which is really what's making science really fun for this young generation. I'll give you an example. At the Duncan Neurological Research Institute, we have 33 investigators working on the brain and brain diseases. They come from 10 to 15 different disciplines, including 2 engineers. Computational scientists, pathologists, geneticists, neurologists. And they and their people under them, so we've got 400 scientists in the building, they love the fact they can collaborate to solve a big challenge. That's how they're solving these very big challenging disorders, is by people each bringing their own skills. And I think everybody finds room for them to shine by being part of that big puzzle. And you said it, and that's exactly. And I think the young scientists are not as worried about their own path per se as solving a big challenge. So collaborations among the next generation is really much more prevalent, I would say, than 50 years ago.
We've got questions from the audience. I want to make sure I take some from our audience here, please.
Thank you, ladies. Enjoyed your presentation. You touched upon guilt and when it came to children, and also self-doubt. Do you have any advice about balancing careers? I heard one time at a conference, one lady was talking, what life-work balance? She said there's no life-work balance. There's the rotating areas of neglect.
I love it.
But, yeah, so what are your comments or advice about balancing?
I think for my career, it's absolutely, I wouldn't call it rotating elements of neglect, but I would have said, on and off pathways. So yeah, I'd oftentimes in my career, I didn't talk a lot about it here, I worked for the same boss in the same group for 2 out of the 3 boys. I wasn't going to go very far, and I thought, this is it, but this is all I can do. I have to be able to have a constant place to go, people that know me, that they know they can help. And so that became a time period in my career where I didn't have a lot of progress. And so, yeah, so just personally, I like that. You don't have to balance it all together, so you just kind of have to have that, what did you say, rotating
Areas of
neglect.
One day, job comes first, one day a sick child.
But I think it's for me anyway, I recognize that it didn't always have to be that way. That it was my choice to either spend more time at work or spend more time at home or whatever I needed. So I think that was important for me.
I think for me it is life. That's it. Simple. It is life. I think that I did give the children the priority. If they were sick, the experiment will have to be repeated. I dropped everything and went and took care of them. But, we had structure, and their time was sacred. And when I was at work and they were in school, it was fine. And use help. And you mentioned support. I mean, my husband was a great support. He's busy. He's chair of cardiology. So obviously he's had a very busy career, but he we were partners and friends. It takes a village and help, right? Having somebody help, babysitters who stayed during the day and so on and help when they were little. So it somehow all worked out. I don't know how we did it, but it does work out. I see my daughter and my daughter-in-law, and son, and son-in-law, they're doing it. So it's life.
My boss tells me we got time for one more question. Please.
First, I always enjoy hearing from the smart half of the world. My field is geoscience, and starting from the 1990s and even more recently, articles opinion articles in Science and Nature, been discussions of the institutional limitations for women in the field. My field and industry, I've been working with women all my career, had women bosses, have not seen that as much. And thinking about what Professor Lane said a few moments ago, are there some aspects of where we start academically that ought to be considered and corrected to have a lot more opportunities? And I am gratified that my Rice Geology Department has a very strong group of women faculty. Thank you.
Anybody want to comment? Let me say one thing about, since I raised this issue, we don't do it quite right in academia. In many universities around the country, you talk to the graduate students and the postdocs, they're not really very happy. If they get in trouble with one thesis advisor, they're in trouble because the money there to support them as graduate students in second, third year, whatever, is with that particular person. If that doesn't work out, maybe you can find somebody else, maybe not. A long time I've felt that the departments and the universities as a whole ought to have a greater responsibility for the lives and livelihoods of the students who come in across the Sally Port. And but I don't know how to do it, and I'll get a lot of cards and letters after that. Let me take one more question. Sorry.
Yes, so I started also in the geoscience, the oil and gas industry back in 1979. And I was one of very few women who in the oil industry at the time. And at some point, I was going into a meeting and the exploration manager said, "So Wanda, are you going to get the coffee for us?" I was stunned. I said, "No, I'm not." But moving on, I have 3 daughters and they're all working, and I see how different industries have accommodated women in the industry. There are rooms for nursing mothers now, and of course, working remotely has helped. One of my daughters is a epidemiologist at Texas Children's Hospital. She's able to, when her son is sick, she's able to work remotely a couple of days. And so, have you seen in the oil and gas industry? Have you seen accommodations that companies have made for working women?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's very important that, so flexible working, that didn't exist. Mother's rooms in every location. Paternity policies. More time off. It was called disability leave when I was in that's what I had to take. I think, but I'll be honest, in the oil industry, we have a long way to go compared to some other industries, and that's what's holding us back. And that's why I'm a big proponent of we need to do more, because it's going to take a diverse workforce to actually solve these problems that we have. And so, yes, thank you for sharing. But yeah, that's really, really important, the accommodations. And I also want to say another thing just real quickly that I talk a lot about to underrepresented students that have struggled, went to school, got their degrees in engineering, in science, in math, and then they get to industry and they do it for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and then they go do something else. Maybe it's HR, maybe it's something that they feel is, especially for women, a little easier to manage. They just literally 30% of the quality of their life just disappeared. And they had already gotten their engineering degree, especially women. I'm talking about pay. I'm talking about being able to then go to work and have somebody take care of your child. And we need to talk about that when we talk to women, especially ones that have already gone through the difficulty of getting their degrees.
Apparently, some of our university athletes are doing quite well now. So maybe we can, offline, we can have a conversation. I lied with your patience. I'll take one more question right here.
Not so much a question, but a comment. When I first entered working world, I worked in the national security business. I worked for the nuclear weapons, one of the nuclear weapons laboratories. There were no women. They just didn't exist. But when I left, some 20 plus years later, we had women executive leadership in vice presidents, presidents of the laboratories, secretaries of energy, the head of the National Nuclear Security Agency, all women in those roles. So there's progress made, and there's opportunity for women in, at least in the environment that I was involved in. And I think we see some level of progress, which I applaud greatly.
Progress? Are we seeing progress?
Oh, yes.
In all of your fields?
I wouldn't be here.
And there's more to go, right?
Yes.
More work to do. This has been a terrific discussion. I feel privileged to be up here with you, and would thank all of you for taking the time to discuss this with us. This is near to our heart, this idea of the civic scientist, engineer, technological professionals as a way of encouraging young people to take seriously the rewards of this career, which Huda described earlier. So, and all of you who are still watching us on YouTube or wherever we are appearing, are we appearing on YouTube? Thank you very much for tuning in, sending your questions, and thank all of you for being here today.